Testing 1, 2, 3. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. I wanted to start with today. It says, I have a friend who sort of steamrolls over everybody around him, and everybody says it's because he has a low self-esteem. Can that be true? Well, yes. Some people who have a really doubtful opinion about their own abilities or their own self-esteem really try to make up for it, compensate for it by being bossy, boisterous, rowdy, bullies, braggarts, loud. Sometimes you see that sort of thing, but you also see the opposite. Sometimes people who have a very good opinion of themselves are also inclined to lord it over others because they don't see others in the same way as, say, the average, and they may be sort of aggressive. So what that really says is that you can't tell by just looking at a person's behavior the why of the behavior. You can't tell what the real motivation is behind some of it. You know, it seems as if we have a little picture of ourselves on the inside, and that little picture of ourselves has to look good to us. We'll polish it, we'll dust it off, we'll do whatever, we embellish it, do whatever is necessary to keep that little picture of ourselves looking good to us. Now, that's important because somebody on the outside can't see that picture. But so what this really amounts to sometimes is a person's dignity as the person sees himself. You don't want to walk on somebody's dignity. That'll get you in trouble in a hurry. You don't want to make the person look bad to himself. That'll usually get people quite angry or upset. And by rights it should. Here's another one. It says, some of the literature being published today about divorce seems to come down on your side, in other words, agreeing with me, and some on the other side. What gives? Well, I've noticed that several publications, several things recently have been really admitting that divorce is not good for children. It's not good for families. There's much more literature out today that seems to say that. But there's also usually something about it, the exceptions, where children have done well after a divorce, and a divorce situation in the family seem to have been with good results. But I've always looked at it as if, more often than not, divorce is negative. The negative consequences outweigh the positive consequences. Now, of course, there are exceptions. But good research should find some evidence on both sides. Well, here's an interesting one. Someone posed a question. I'm getting married again after being widowed, and I don't know what my children should call my new husband. Father, Dad, or just by his name, Joe. Do you have opinions? Well, yes, it depends a little bit on how old your children are and what the relationship is with Joe. I think if they were old enough to know their own father, then sometimes it's a little insensitive to try to force the children to call the new man father, because they may have a very deep loyalty to their own father. On the other hand, why not let Joe and the children work it out? And if Joe turns out to be very good at parenting, the children probably will come up with something that's pleasing to your new husband as well as to the children. So I don't think just imposing and saying, children, you must call this man father or dad or something, I don't think that's particularly important in that kind of situation. Let them work it out. There's a question that comes up. There's a lot of discussion going on about genes these days, the gene theory, and what is our behavior determined by, and characteristics. Can it be true that our genes govern most of what we grow up to be? Yes, it can be. I remember about 50 years ago I was giving a presentation to an organization, and I had concluded at that time that about 51% of our behavior as adults is governed by what we inherit. Not as much by what we grow up in. And who we are is much more important. Who we are in terms of who we are biochemically, our own genetic makeup. The evidence seems to be coming more and more to that because we're reading. I read quite a bit of this. And one of my sons is doing research in this area, and he shares a lot of the material. That more and more things are being explained on the basis of genes and how genes really contribute, keep us from behaving a certain way, or in effect force us to react a certain way. So most all of us would agree that we can certainly have animals with certain characteristics like a pointer or a setter or sheepdogs or whatever like that. And we never doubt that that's due to the heredity. Well, perhaps we have traits like that in people. That's also influenced by the genes. One of my former colleagues had a sign in his office, and I always found it intriguing. And the sign, as I remember it, said something like this: "Don't try to teach pigs how to sing. You can't do it, and it just upsets the pigs anyway." I thought that was a very interesting statement because the man himself was very much into the sociological patterns of we're influenced so much by what we do. But I thought that was, and still is, I think that's a very good summary statement of really what's going on most of the time. I had an interesting inquiry not long ago. I shared with you. The party said, in a sense, I feel so sensitive in most social situations that I usually try to avoid groups. Is there anything I can do to help get over that feeling? I don't think it's anxiety. This woman pointed out that she didn't think that she was anxious about being in groups. It's just that she was preoccupied about the people and how and what was going on in the groups, how they behaved and what was going on. So I found that a very intriguing, interesting question. What was it that she was really asking for? So often people who seem to describe discomfort in groups have agoraphobia, fear of groups, fear of open places and marketplaces, that sort of thing. So I tried putting myself in a place of somebody who would be thought of as overly sensitive to what's going on in a group. And I decided it's probably a hidden talent then, to turn that around, to make use of that sensitivity, rather than think of it as a problem, an impediment. Think of it as a talent. For example, to go into a group and to be very sensitive as to what's going on in the group and who's doing what to whom and under what circumstances and what the environment itself is. Those would be very nice things for a group leader to have, that ability. It'd be a good thing for a novelist, somebody who could write about people. It would be a good thing for an artist. Sometimes we see people who make caricatures, cartoons of people, and they seem to be able to catch a particular attitude or something and portray it. Well, these people are sensitive. It's how they do that. They're sensitive, tune right into the behavior of other people. So why not do that? Why not start by making some notes? Keep some notes and make descriptions. Keep descriptions of what goes on around you and the people you're with, what's going on, the who, the where, the what. Keep making some notes about these things, and you may find that not only will you look forward to getting into groups because you'll be able to study them, so to speak, and to see how accurate your own impressions are, but you might make good use of that material, like writing a biography or writing up about other people. So I think it would be a talent rather than a problem. Look at it that way, and I think you'll find it very intriguing. Here's another one. It says, do old people just fall apart suddenly, or is it a gradual process of deterioration? Well, both happen. There are some people who seem to go along just fine, not a thing seems to be wrong with them, functioning adequately, and then something happens to them. Maybe a minor accident, a fall, a little problem, and they seem to spiral downward from that. They don't seem to recover from that. There are people who seem to be old all their life. Other people seem to be young all their life. There are people who are in a process in the middle age, they start disengaging, withdrawing from life, and setting the stage, and they seem to act old. Well, all of us know people, and I saw one. I had the opportunity of talking to a school teacher the other day who's 97 years old, had a mind just clickety-clack as if she were 27, but she was in a wheelchair. In other words, this person's mind was quite sharp, quite alert, had very good memory, but her body was wearing out. And we see the opposite, don't we? We see some people whose mind seems to go very quickly, and the body's in good shape. Somebody, my former physician told me that I would probably die in good health. In other words, I probably would just keel over one day, heart stops or something, whatever, because I seem to be in pretty good shape for somebody my age. That old lady the other day I talked to, 97, it was very interesting. What she could remember, how she could remember it. Actually, I visited her with my brother, and she was my brother's school teacher at one time. And that's why we had looked her up. Well, it's a very interesting kind of behavior when we see people who are that way. We like to listen to them because of their accuracy, usually in their memory. Funny thing about memory, though, isn't it? Usually in a very old person's memory, we don't have anybody to test it with. We don't have anybody's memory to compare it to. So a person that age tells us something happened and nobody's around to say, no, it wasn't that way, it was another way. So sometimes people can fill in detail. We call that confabulation. And all of us do that to some extent. We don't have to be old to do that. Kids can do it. They'll start to tell something, and they may not remember a particular detail, but they'll just make the story fit. There are a lot of people who enjoy doing that, and they know what they're doing at the time, make a good story, and they're intentionally making up a good story. I used to have an old friend, Louis, who he would delight you. And you knew very well that half of what he was saying wasn't true, but he was making a good story out of it. And we do like good storytellers, don't we? Well, until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Talking about old people, we hear the word senile over and over again. Somebody says, oh, that person is so senile, or I don't want to become senile. And we hear this sort of thing as if the word senile has some particular and special meaning. Well, the word senile means old. So when somebody says, well, I don't ever want to become senile, what are they really saying? They don't want to become old. They don't want to mature. Well, the word senile also is usually associated in psychiatric terms, or in gerontological terms, or in geriatrics, with senile dementia. In other words, a loss of memory and a loss of mental functioning associated with age. But there is no particular disease called aging. We have a lot of conditions that are associated with aging, but aging itself is not a disease. It's a normal process. And I would think that any of us would know that in a sense, because how do you grow up if you don't age? You can't do it. Well, speaking of growing up, here's another question. It says, at what age are our children mature enough to be independent? To live independently away from home. I heard this discussion going on. I made a note of it to share with you. There's a reason I bring it here, because it has a lot of ramifications. You know, it used to be that young women didn't leave home except to get married. And then a young man didn't expect to get married until he could afford to support a wife and a family. And families were expected. And it used to be then, in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, that when young women went away to college, the families oftentimes paid extra money for a sorority. The colleges, for both male and females, the colleges were acting in what's called loco parentis. They were acting in the place of the parent. And the colleges had rules and regulations which govern the behavior of people below age 21, such as you had to live in a dorm, you had to be in at certain times, there's no smoking or drinking and that sort of thing going on campus. Well, colleges quit being parents. I remember very clearly at Plattsburgh State when a vote was taken by the college president asking the student body to vote on whether or not they wanted integrated dormitories. And apparently there was some kind of federal provision at that time saying if they didn't make some effort, if a college or university didn't make some effort to do away with sex discrimination, they wouldn't be funded. So, if my memory tells me, the college president knew what he was going to do before he got the results of the vote. Actually, the majority of the students voted against it. But they went ahead and did a sort of a splicing kind of thing, men on one end of a dorm and women on the other, and men on one floor and women on the other. Prior to that time, they were all clearly separated by buildings. We see this sort of thing going on where not only have colleges quit being parents, but the fraternities and the sororities have quit regulating students. And some of them have gotten in trouble lately because they've been sponsoring wild parties. I say lately, in the last few years it's gotten worse. So that sometimes serious students say if they really want to get something out of college and prepare themselves for a professional life, they'll stay out of sororities and fraternities. And I've certainly known students who said if they really want to be successful academically, they can't live in a dormitory. Well, it's too much of a party time. Colleges have changed places so that colleges are rated. I've forgotten what it's called, but there's a rating of colleges about how much of a party school it is. And some students pick out the college that's mostly parties. Well, a lot of difference. And also society itself has changed. So the question started off, the question was, how old do people have to be before they're mature enough to leave home? It used to be, it was clear that 17 or 18 was old enough to go off and start trying to earn your own living. And when people finished high school, it used to be we didn't have 12 grades, we only had 11, and some places didn't have but 10. In earlier years in the last century, they had considered that finishing school. So what happens? Well, we have more and more people going to school, and what we seem to be doing, in my opinion, we seem to be keeping people immature. More and more restrictions in one way, at the same time more and more freedoms in another way. But the kind of freedoms don't seem to be adding up to maturity. And makes it a little bit of a puzzle, doesn't it? I've known people who were quite mature at 17. I'm sure anyone viewing this program has too. And we also see people who are quite immature at 27. Some people never seem to grow up. And there's a big mistake right now in the belief system that couples who shack up that they're going to mature. Well, that doesn't seem to be. The cohabitating couples don't seem to be maturing. That's a strange kind of thing. Well, someone asked me the other day when I would have liked to have lived if I wasn't living at the present time. I guess they got that impression because I keep talking about how things were in the traditional and the Orthodox families. And I got to thinking about it. I had a good experience. I've lived 3/4 of a century, a little over that, and a foot, both ends of a century. And where I grew up, though, as a youngster, it was sort of a undeveloped, backward place, a backward society. In other words, without electricity, people didn't advance quickly. It was sort of like the 1840s in a way, without electricity. I had the one-room schoolhouse for a time. No electricity, no radios, of course, no television. They weren't invented. It didn't become popular until the 1950s. I'm talking about television. So in a sense, we had buggies, people with horse and buggies sprinkled in with the cars when I was a youngster. But the biggest thing I was thinking about, the biggest difference, with all the modern conveniences, of course, I like them. I like the food and the shelter that I experience today. So I'd like to have had that in the earlier times, because the big difference, it seemed to me that 50, 60, 70 years ago, people looked forward. They had a future to look to. They had dreams. Now, not everybody expected to be able to hit the dreams and to attain all their dreams, of course. But take, for example, to think about it, to dream about a little house with a white picket fence and children running around the yard. Do you think young people today think that way? Most of them don't seem to think that way. What are they looking forward to? Having a PC? Having more material things? They seem as a group not to be looking forward to a family, the continuity of their own generations over a period of time. Young people today don't seem to be doing that. And it's not just in New York or the United States. It seems to be in the Western world. Our economy and our social patterns have shifted so dramatically. It's a question. What do young people look forward to? Oh, they may look forward to a career, to be an engineer, a physician, astronomer, whatever. But in terms of the person they're going to be, what do they look forward to? See, we have a very sharp decrease in the number of children people have. We have more and more couples that don't want any children at all. They tell themselves they're perfectly happy to be childless, unmarried. We have, first time, according to the census information, we have for the first time that the traditional family is not now the majority. We've had very dramatic increases in the number of unmarried people. What do they look forward to? How are they really believing the future? What does the future hold for them? So you put all these things together, and I have to come down on the side that I think I would prefer to live at a time in a society where there was indeed something to look forward to, not just material things. Be interesting to see what you think about it. Well, change topics a little bit. Here's one that says, my husband never seems to listen to me, but he says he wants to. What can I do? Well, it's good that the husband says he wants to listen. At least that's a good answer. So why not try the two-question answer? Two-question answer is a little gimmick. I didn't think of it, but I've used it many times with couples, where you ask two questions on the subject of whatever your partner is saying to you before you render an opinion, or before you change this topic, or before you get in your own 2 cents worth. You ask two questions. What you have to do then is to listen. You have to listen. In order to do that, you have to know what the subject is. And it really promotes conversation, and I would suggest that you show your husband how to do that. You have to practice a little bit, and it's fun to start with. But when both people are interested enough in whatever the subject is, you can take something as simple as the weather, and people love to talk about the weather, don't they? Say, it looks like a beautiful day today, or it's terrible, it's snowing, sleeting, whatever. Instead of just saying, yeah. Why not ask two questions about the topic? Well, have you heard what the forecast is for tomorrow? Or do you remember last year at this time what it might have been? Two questions, any kind of question on the topic of weather. As dry to some people as the weather seems to be. And our weather has certainly been dry lately, hasn't it? I think you'll find that intriguing. Now, sometimes people don't listen to each other, and we have this complaint pretty frequently, because they really don't want to. Sometimes people don't listen because they don't want to comment, because they have the impression that if I say something, I'm going to be shot out of the saddle. I'm going to be ridiculed. I'm going to be put down, or Some people don't comment because they may not agree, but they don't want to get into an argument. There are a lot of reasons why people seem not to listen, whether or not they really heard the person, the partner. And we see that happening. Oftentimes people are not listening. There's a good reason to the person. Sometimes this is a way of controlling the conversation. But we usually interpret it to mean that you're really not interested in what I'm saying. So, are we? Well, the two-question answer is a suggestion. Tell your husband you'd like to try it, explain it, practice it, see how it works out. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. I have an interesting question from a young school teacher. He said, I'm a sixth grade school teacher. It's my first year. Have the kids always been this unruly? Well, it's interesting what they don't teach, isn't it? When they don't teach the teachers how to take care of the classroom discipline. But I made the suggestion that he ask his grandparents about school and how they behaved in school and why they behave that way in school. I think you'd find it very interesting. In other words, any grandparent today probably can remember going to school and when kids were behaved. You could line up a group of kids from recess or going into school or whatever, tell them to be quiet, and they were quiet. Oh, there was always somebody who would try to whisper or something, but basically the children whom I was in school with were pretty nice kids about behaving. Well, here's one. It says, my 13-year-old son has told me to get lost. I'm separated from his mother, and it's a messy situation. I have custody, and besides getting mad, what else should I do? 13 years old. Well, if you get mad, it's probably because you don't feel that your son appreciates what effort you went through and are perhaps going through to keep custody or to have custody. It's a messy separation. So that'd be my guess. First, you don't feel appreciated and you're ticked off because the son doesn't act like it. So try giving the son a hug and tell him that you understand that it's not easy. Young kids, you know how it could be. 13-year-old may not want to follow your rules, and I'm assuming and hoping that you have rules. If you don't have some, get some. Nothing quite upsets kids like being in a situation and they don't know what's expected of them. They'll make up their own rules. Now, make up the rules if you don't have them, or if you already have them, review them, make sure that you can live with them, that you set the example of what they are, and that you like them. That you like the rules that you're expecting a 13-year-old to live by. And know perfectly well that any 13-year-old, healthy ones, in the best of circumstances, is going to try to figure out one parent over the other one, which one's easier to get around, what this one permits and what that one permits. So when there's a separation, remember that it's kind of rough on kids. And so if a youngster doesn't like what you're doing, he'd think about being with the other parent. That's perfectly natural. Keep in mind that a 13-year-old is between a man and a boy. Sometimes a teenager doesn't think of himself as a child, doesn't think of himself as a man, is sort of in between. That's sort of uncomfortable. Hasn't grown his male feathers yet, but he's sprouting wings. And wants to assert his own authority. Perfectly normal to want to do that. And what I find is some parents, and I've had several ask me recently about young kids, teenagers, adolescent behavior. I think it's important to keep in mind that the normal, healthy adolescent likes to talk. A normal, healthy adolescent likes to be in a group, be with their buddies. It's girls or boys, they like to be with their friends. They're a groupie. A normal young adolescent doesn't understand the consequences of change. In other words, they can see change, and they may clamor for change and want everybody around them to change to fit their own pattern. But oftentimes, kids that age don't really understand the concept of change and what the consequences are. Now, in a year or two, it makes a big difference because they start understanding these things. They're indifferent to the world at large. Typical 13-year-old doesn't care much about what goes on in the world. They don't like history as a group. Young people typically don't like history. So somebody came up with the idea, don't call it history, call it social studies. And they have a short fuse. They have low frustration tolerance. They want what they want now. They don't want to wait for it. Now, those characteristics of typical healthy adolescence. And so what is a typical healthy parent supposed to do? Well, live with it, for one thing. But keep in mind that these are behavioral characteristics, and you'll get over it. They'll get over it, and everybody goes for the better. It does improve as time goes on. Here's another question. It says, I think my 16-year-old is smoking pot at times. Should I just ignore it or make a fuss? Well, isn't there another option? Aren't there other things that might be done here? Why not find out? Why not talk? Why not listen? Because pot's not good for anybody. And if you don't say anything, then that 16-year-old is going to assume that you don't really care. And if he assumes you don't really care, he or she, that'll be worse perhaps than smoking a pot. Pot's not good for anybody. It doesn't help anything. But there are too many parents who just hope it'll go away, that this is just a phase or fad that people are into. Excuse me. Well, it's not quite that simple. See, there's always a danger that pot leads to other things, and I know there's a lot of argument about that, whether or not it does or doesn't. But I tend to come down on the side that says, yes, the big drug dealers, the big drug guys who run these cartels expect the relatively innocent drugs to lead to bigger drugs. They make much more money on the hard stuff, and that's what they are looking at. Here's another one. It says, our 25-year-old son now is married and has his own family, and he keeps bringing it up about how we treated him so different than we do a 10-year-old who's still at home. So the question comes down, is that something unusual? No. No two children have the same family. Children are living in the same household, same parents, always had the same parents. Don't view them the same and don't view the home the same. Just like no two people have the same marriage. Remember, it's your marriage, my marriage, and our marriage. Well, children look upon the families the same way. And think about it, really. The oldest child in the family is for a time the only child. He's treated like an only child. And if there are other children along the way, each child has particular roles to play. And you take the youngest child in the family. The question had to do with the 25-year-old and the 10-year-old. Well, that 10-year-old home alone, as far as other children, he's also an only child. So he's going to be treated differently than the middle child was treated, in spite of the fact that the parents intend to treat all children the same. Well, we can love them the same, but we'll prefer one's characteristics over another, of course. Pleasing children, appreciative children, those who are supportive and helpful, we tend to appreciate them more. But doesn't mean we love them less or love them more. Actually, it's easy to see in some families where the child who gives the most trouble is the one who's loved most. That seems to come out, and it doesn't mean that that's a fact, but so often that's the perception. The old idea that the wheel that's squeaking is the one that gets the grease. Well, some of you don't know what grease is, but that's the way it is with families. They're never the same. Here's another question, also in dealing with family life. It says, my great-grandson is 3 years old, and he seems depressed. He seems depressed. Can children become depressed like adults? Well, simple answer is yes. In the book, The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, that's the official catalog of mental upsets, disturbances, and disorders, illnesses, it makes note of the fact that children as young as 6 months of age can show signs and symptoms of being depressed and anxious. It's not enough just to define a child as depressed. The question is, what do you do about it? Well, in very young children, particularly young children, they seem to get upset when there's a divorce, a desertion, a death, a separation of the parent. Children have a normal bonding with the parent, and if that parent is taken away, the child naturally gets upset. Now, young people get upset the same way that adults do. With preschoolers, hopefully managing the environment's going to help the situation. With school-age kids, psychotherapy and counseling, and cognitive behavioral work seems to benefit. Help a child see where their thinking is faulty. But they have to be able to talk and to articulate in order to do that kind of therapy. With teenagers, more and more they're giving drugs, trying to treat depression with drugs, and they treat them the same way that they do adults. And there's a lot of study going on to see whether or not that's really the best way to handle it. It seems that for adults, the best therapy is counseling, psychotherapy, and medication, a combination. But it's also found that exercise and activity is also helpful. Well, why wouldn't the same thing be true with children? See, so many children are couch potatoes. They're not getting, we're seeing and reading, hearing about kids being overweight. Why are they overweight? Well, eating too much and exercising too little. Basically, the two ingredients of becoming overweight. So what's happening with these kids? Inactivity and breakup of families, social situation where they live, sad sometimes, very, very sad how the parents treat these kids. it's small wonder they're depressed. And yes, childhood depression is becoming much more common than it used to be. Here's another one. It says, are stories about suicides in the newspapers and television apt to promote suicides or suicide attempts in others? The answer is no. Some recent and very carefully done research in this shows that it has just the opposite effect. There are some exceptions, but most of the time people seeing and hearing about suicides turns people off, turns them away from suicide. There are situations, of course, where lovers make suicide pacts like Romeo and Juliet, or in some of the Eastern religions where a widow might throw herself on the funeral pyre of her husband, where they burn bodies. But most of the time, hearing and reading about suicides in others doesn't in itself promote suicides. Now, we see people sometimes, I've certainly had circumstances of working with people where they may say, well, I want to join my deceased relative, one who just suicided or who died. They want to join them in heaven. But that doesn't usually work out in the context. I don't mean they're not able to join them in heaven, because there are some belief systems say that's exactly the opposite thing to do if you want to join somebody in heaven. But people get over that. That's an immediate feeling that they don't know what they're going to do without the person. So helping people meet the circumstances of suicide is much better. And here's the last question for this particular section. It says, what's the difference between a dwarf and a midget? A midget is simply a small, very small person whose body is in proportion, different parts of the body. Whereas a dwarf, there are several different kinds of dwarfs. Some dwarfs have a normal head and body, but very short arms and legs. That's the more common type of dwarf. You see the people and think of them as very short people, but what's really short about them may be simply the legs and the arms. So until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. Have a good day. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Today we start off with a question I've heard before, and it's been a while though. It says, at what age do you think kids should be allowed to date? Well, I think I see things going on in schools that I don't agree with. In other words, I see dances for 10 and 11-year-old kids in the schools. I don't agree with that. I think that's a little too young, and I think 16 is my favorite age, and kids should be allowed to have individual dating. Sure, I know there'll be a lot of objections to that. But then something happened a few years ago, several years ago now, and we moved to Tallahassee, Florida. We were met with a welcome package, new residents to the city, and in that package was a newspaper printing of what parents in Tallahassee expected in terms of the behavior of their children, what ages would different activities be allowed. And it was a very fine article. People in Tallahassee had gotten together apparently and agreed on this sort of thing, the majority of them, of those at meeting, and it gave some standards. So it was very nice to move into a new place and have some standards. I had beginning teenage children at that time, and we didn't get subjected to this, well, so-and-so's mother's letting her go or him go, and their parents let him go, and the arguments that most kids give to the parents. I thought it was very good to have a standard like that, and I'd recommend it every community have it, so that children really would have some better guidelines than what they have, because they don't have any. They're following the patterns of the adults, and the adults set up these programs at 10 and 11 years of age for dating and supposedly dancing and that sort of thing. No, I think it'd be better to have it another way around. Here's another question. It's quite a different, from a different slant. It says, what do I think of the compulsory military training? Well, I'm in favor of it, and I always have been. I think it's very important if we had a compulsory military training. I think we'd knock out most of the problems that we have with adolescents. And the military has a very good way of training people in character. Now, if you don't believe that, think of the training that the Marines get. That's basically character building to become a Marine. But several of the branches, specialized branches of service, do a great deal, and in a very short time. And what the kids today growing up, they're not getting it. So many of them are not getting it at home. I think it'd be one way of doing it. However, of course, you'd have to have compulsory military training with a moral code. I think, for example, the old expression of an officer and a gentleman is very good. People were expected to be both. If you were an officer, then you were supposed to be a gentleman. At least you knew what a gentleman was supposed to do. It didn't mean that everybody always acted that way, of course not. And I think the military training, compulsory training, should be for both males and females, but of course in segregated different establishments. Marines don't integrate their training for men and women, and it seems to work better. Many of the problems could be eliminated. We don't really need to train them to do the same things. And it would require, though, a philosophical approach. What is the training that we want the people to have, and what kind of people are we trying to get them to be after the military training? Not just be good in combat. That's the essential ingredient. We have to have a ready reserve, and we have to have people ready to really fight, if need be. And so many people today don't have that attitude. They say, well, whatever. Here's another question. It says, what can we do as a nation to help the idea of family life become a really meaningful idea again? Well, there are several things. I think it's a good question, but I think there are several things that can be done. And not really hard. First, somebody's going to say, well, you can't do that. Well, I don't know why you can't, because the anti-family forces have been at work for a long time. So let's see what we could do here. First of all, we could adopt the idea that family life is important, that it's essential for the health and welfare of our nation. And I'm happy to see that we have a current president who is saying that sort of thing. I was surprised when I heard it the other day and read it. But he spelled out some things that promote family life. Well, I think this is one of the things that's important, is to be able to have a consistent pattern all across the nation. We could have programs set up. We could have some of these cartoon programs. I remember when Sesame Street, for example, first started advocating abortion, and some of us at the time objected very, very strongly. But children at very young ages are indoctrinated with things about family life. We know that's going on. we know it used to be. In fact, that was one of the reasons that New York State University of New York wanted me to come to New York. It was because I was a family life specialist, supposedly, and they had just adopted a curriculum to promote family life. Well, it wasn't very long after that they switched around, and some of the powers that be decided that they'd rather promote something else, like women's lib and that sort of thing. But if we had television programs and we had school programs, all focusing on the benefits of the family and the pleasures of family life, it would be healthier for everybody. And quit promoting some of these things as if they were all equal. They're not. All the good research shows that they're not really equal. There are advantages for family life. There are advantages for being married. Here's a question. From time to time it jumps up. People see me or they stop me on the street or something like that and say, hey, I don't know what to do with my ADDH child. ADD, attention deficit disorder, and hyperactivity. Well, any family that has a child with attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity has some problems. It doesn't mean the problem started in the family, but that type of child, that type of member in the family is going to create some problems of his own. My suggestion is first, if you haven't done this before, start a diary. This is what I related when the question was asked. Because I find that so often parents are talking about their children with hyperactivity and attention deficit. These behaviors seem to be more pronounced at certain times, in certain situations, around certain people. And you won't know that unless you keep a diary. I found, for example, that some children were hyperactive only at home, others only at school. Number one, sometimes the children are acting out problems in the home. Tension in the home rises, whatever it may be. It may be nobody's fault, particularly, for example, crises of some kind, illnesses, accidents. Children who are sensitive to hyperactivity and attention deficit, this may increase their symptoms. They may start acting out in certain ways. So that you look at the pattern. If you find a pattern after you keep a diary, then decide what it is. Identify what the triggering elements are in the environment, and talk to the child about it. Children are usually well aware of their behavior, and oftentimes they're told they can't do anything about it. But most of the time they can. There is an element of control. It doesn't mean they're totally in control, or they wouldn't be diagnosed that way. But who made the diagnosis in the first place? Not anything wrong with complimenting the child when the child is doing well, and trying then to eliminate the negative behaviors. You know, the old song about accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative. It works. It works well. But I feel sorry for any family that has a hyperactive child or an autistic child, because that particular family has some adjustment problems to make to the child and because of the child. It doesn't mean that the family has caused it, because we know that sometimes these are strictly neurological factors and chemical factors in the body, and parents wouldn't know how to cause it if they wanted to try to cause it. So too often the parents feel guilty about it. We also know that it tends to run in families, don't we? I'm sure everybody has seen a hyperactive person grow up to become a hyperactive adult and then have hyperactive children. Well, whatever is causing that hyperactivity, of course, would tend to run in families. Then we have the patterns of genetics that put on top of that somewhere in the chemistries, and we have the nutrition factors. Some people can't eat sugars, and we're seeing more and more that some children are allergic and have allergic reactions, and they take it out, and it shows up as not only in physical symptoms and signs, but in hyperactive behavior, because the child becomes restless, agitated. So hyperactivity, keep a diary, look at it, study the pattern, see what can be done. Here's a question about old folks. And it says, my grandmother keeps forgetting and repeating herself. What can I do? Well, it makes a difference about what she forgets. Is it significant? Is it important what she forgets? For example, does she forget to turn off the stove, or turn off the water, or turn on hot water and forget it? Or she forget who she is, or where she is, or how to get home? If that's the kind of forgetting, then that's important, and she needs to have a thorough physical examination. She needs one anyway if she hadn't had one in a couple of years. Good medical workup is always indicated, because sometimes those symptoms can be helped. But now, if it's just that she forgets minor things, who's bothered by it? If it's not really important, maybe she likes to tell the same story over and over again. Well, you can ask questions. Your memory needs exercise, so ask questions. I find and have for years that to carry on a conversation with somebody who's repeating a story that I may have heard many other times or several times, I ask questions about different things. And I find that the information is usually interesting. It's also interesting to the person telling the story, because that person may not have thought about some of these things for a long time and say, well, maybe that is my memory, that's just my bad memory. But I think you'll find that that's the best way to do it. Good stories deserve a good conversation. And some of these really old people, they grew up before there was radio and television, and so they entertained each other, and the families entertained each other with stories. So, it's not a bad thing to do. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good day. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Here's a question that, I hear this sort of thing from time to time. And the question says, what can I do about my husband who seems to have a compulsion to dominate me? We've been hearing a whole lot about dominating men. Ever since the Women Live movement started, we've been hearing about that. But then you look around, you listen, you look, and you find that, yes, there are people, one of the couples seems to be the dominant one. But first, to answer the question specifically, is it something new? In other words, the party who asked the question, my answer was, is it something new? Is this behavior that has he always been this way? And if he's always been this way, then maybe you're the one who's changed. Maybe he hasn't changed. I hear this from time to time. I hear husbands say, well, I haven't changed anything. All of a sudden, she acts a certain way that's different. And maybe it's that the wife doesn't want to be dominated anymore. Maybe she's making more money. She has a good job. She feels like an equal partner, not the submissive one. And we find that. we find that sometimes way back, even old Carl Jung, way back about 1920, talked about one person in a marriage as the contained and the other is the container. Well, that's a little bit strong. But if your husband's behavior is fairly new, that is, he hasn't always tried to be dominant, then think about it another way. Is there something going on in work? Did he change his work? Has he been sick lately? Is he feeling secure, or is something threatening him? Oftentimes people who want to dominate others feel insecure. And it shows up that sometimes the less secure we feel, the more insecure, the more we want to dominate and show that we are secure and compensate for it by dominating other people. In the relationship, though, if something is changed that way, something at work, something in the family happened, is it something, an accident or a child, or in your own life, something different there for you, and you might talk it over. If you don't have any finding, you think about it and you can't find any justification for it. Think about your own. Is it something that you've changed? And then talk it over. Then there's always another pattern that sometimes works, and sometimes people think it's crazy to even try it, but to take it to extreme. In other words, I've seen it happen. It's called a paradoxical intention method. Fancy word, isn't it? But what it really means is really prescribing the behavior you're trying to get rid of. That's what it relates to. For example, I've asked a wife sometime in that situation where he had a very dominating husband to play it up to the extreme, to be ultra submissive, to show the husband what he was doing. In other words, may I do this? May I do that? Are you sure you want me to do this? Is it all right if I do this? Just keep pushing that until the husband, get out of my hair. Go on and do what you need to do. And that's what was the intention in the first place. Sometimes it takes a little nerve to do a paradoxical intention. So have a good handle on it before you start. Here's another one. So someone told me that New York State has an assisted suicide law on the books. Is that true? No, not at this particular time. It's not true. There's one intended to go on the books, to have physician-assisted suicide made legal. But right now, to assist somebody in suicide, it's a felony. Now, isn't that a strange thing? Here it is, a felony. If anybody, as far as I know, the law is still in effect. It's a felony to try to assist somebody to die. And yet here's a proposed law that says, but a physician can help you die. I think that's a little weird. What we have in New York State, and I think it is a little worse than weird, we already have a statute that says if a physician believes a person would get unduly upset if the physician discussed do not resuscitate orders with that patient, the physician, in agreement with another physician, can enter that on the patient's chart, do not resuscitate, without talking to the patient, and even though the patient is competent. Now, I fought that when it was being proposed. Obviously, I didn't do a good job because it's got on the books anyway. But there are people, and they are the humanistic people, who think everybody has a right to suicide. That's who promotes and pushes this sort of thing, the people who believe that everybody has a right of suicide. So the Hemlock Society and a few others that I started off as a youth euthanasia educational group, which was a part of Planned Parenthood, by the way, back in the 1930s. they push these laws, and it's come into effect, and as you probably know, the state of Oregon has one already, and it was just made legal in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, even before it was made legal the other day, I guess a few weeks ago now, it was being reported that approximately 20% of the deaths were physician-assisted suicide, and about 20% of those deaths were not discussed with the patient. The patient didn't know about it, had not asked for it. So I think this physician-assisted suicide business opens the door to a terrible social movement. Even Kevorkian, this character, the pathologist who specialized and deliberately got himself put in jail trying to make this movement come about, most of the people that he assisted, I've read, that he assisted to die did not have terminal illnesses. I've read that most of them were depressed. Well, I've worked with a lot of depressed people, and I've also worked with a lot of people who attempted suicide or was really thinking about it. And I'll knock on wood, I haven't had anybody that I've worked with and was working with since 1953 actually commit suicide. Last one I worked with who did commit suicide was that long ago. That's quite a while back. And I think it's a very sad pattern for our society to open that door saying that life isn't worthwhile. You know, for a society to continue to exist and for a society to continue to thrive and to grow, it has to have a motivation for survival, not a motivation for death. It'd be like the little lemmings who go jump off the cliffs into the sea on a regular basis. But that's an instinct-driven behavior. It's not because a thought-out plan, as far as we know. Those little animals don't think that way. But we have to be motivated to survive. Every cell in our body wants to survive. You cut yourself and it starts healing immediately. All of the very intricate patterns in our body's defenses are all geared up to live, to survive, and to bear fruit, to bear children. A great deal of our behavior in our body is made up of that sort of protective mechanism to make sure that there is a perpetuation of ourselves and our offsprings. I'm also puzzled as I mentioned this, I know I mentioned this on the program, but it's been a long time ago. It used to be that the old Hebrew father, before Christ, had the authority and could command the death of a child. And it was perfectly legal. The old Hebrew father could say, I don't want that one, I don't want this one. We've turned it around. Now the mother can. Which goes into the next question about what do I think about the minimum sentence that was handed out up in Franklin County, reported in the Press Republican not long ago, about a man who got his fiancée or girlfriend pregnant and didn't want her pregnant, so he beat her and kicked her until she miscarried, and the baby died. Strange, isn't it? If that same woman had gone to an abortion clinic right down here on Brinkerhoff Street in Plattsburgh, which is the only abortion clinic in the North Country, she could have just had the child eliminated and no fanfare. But for the father of the child, ever since Roe versus Wade, some of us for 29 years now have been fussing about this. The father of the child has no say, and it's not that we want the father to have a say in the abortions. We don't think either the parent ought to be able to get an abortion. But it's a puzzle, isn't it? Now, my understanding in just reading the paper was that they had to use a little different approach in order to convict the man for causing the abortion. There is a proposed statute right now in New York state legislature to make it a crime if one knowingly or intentionally causes the death of an unborn child. I hope it works, because I think it's a good thing. That the unborn child is important. It always has been in history. We've always known that the unborn child had the right of inheritance. That's been a pattern for centuries, that just because a child hadn't been born at the time of the father's death, the child was still entitled to a full share of the inheritance that other children were. So I think that case in Franklin County illustrates a need for us to do something better. It's a strange situation. I'm in favor of the man being convicted for causing the death of his child. I'm in favor of that. That's not the question. I think it's just strange kind of law, though, that will convict the father, and the mother could turn right around and have the child aborted without any fanfare at all. Most people don't even want to think about that sort of thing. You know, for many years now, we've been going around talking about these things, what it's like, what the laws allow. Oftentimes, it's not what the law says; it's what the law allows that's more important. And that Roe versus Wade ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court was very explicit. And then the later hearings and rulings having to do with the state of Missouri, all of them carefully sidestep the value of the unborn child. But some of them rule very clearly. Some of these rulings have ruled very clearly that the father of the child has no say whatsoever, that this is entirely a woman's right. Even though that came out of the U.S. Supreme Court, I think it is unconstitutional, because it's a discrimination on the basis of it, and part of the Constitution says you can't discriminate. But it's discrimination against the unborn child, straight up. Well, until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good day. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Start with, says, you've been in counseling a while. Have you seen problems of pedophilia? Pedophilia is in the news a lot lately, isn't it? Well, yes, I have. In my work years ago, I worked as a psychologist and a psychiatric social worker in mental hospitals. And what they used to do with pedophiles, they'd convict them of mental illness and sentence them for treatment in a mental hospital, because they didn't know what else to do with them. Because usually these people, the ones I saw, we used to see from time to time, they were not erratic. They were usually well-intentioned, well-meaning people who hold a job and do all the usual things in society normally. And they could convict them of being mentally ill. They couldn't convict them of being legally insane. But it was sort of the anguish of society that would get them into mental hospitals, and then we'd have them. I've tried to work with them, and also in my own private practice in the years I've worked with a few. And but in Texas, where I worked in the mental hospitals, it may have just so happened, but the largest percentage of the pedophiles were Protestant ministers, and there's a possible explanation for that, because at the place where I worked in that particular geographic area, there were only about 2% Catholic in the population, and only about 2% Jews in the population. So there may have been pedophiles in other religious groups, but I don't recall ever seeing one in a mental hospital. But the percentage and proportion of the population was quite different. Not like some of the other places. But my impression about pedophilia is that it's not really the sexual satisfaction that people are after. It's more of a dominance, a mastery, obedience, and sometimes it's a retaliation, trying to impose on others what one had imposed on oneself. And I've only known, I believe, of a handful, literally 6 or 8 cases of women in my 53 years, but had many more cases of men, but never really a large proportion. But pedophilia is a strange sort of thing. It's both heterosexual and homosexual. Most of the time people aren't both, but it seems that pedophilia is more common in people who have same-sex attraction than in the heterosexuals, and all the clamor about married priests and that sort of thing. I don't think that'll have any bearing on it, and that's my experience with it. The last pedophile I worked with was a married person, had children, that sort of thing, and I thought he was rather typical. He referred to me by some law enforcement group in court, but I don't think the celibacy is a big factor. If people would remain celibate, then there wouldn't be any pedophilia. But we're seeing all kinds of strange things, and I was puzzled by, I think it was yesterday, that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled about pornography with children. Children's pornography, about the virtual pornography not being against the Constitution because it interfered with the right of free speech. Well, I'd like to read that ruling. All I've heard about is what was in a newspaper and a very brief report on some television news channel, but I'd really like to read it and know what the logic was, because it would appear to me to be much more serious than a freedom of speech. If the intention of using virtual pornography, virtual children, that sort of thing, if the intention was always the same, to incite people, to get people to do certain kinds of behaviors, then I think we have to get into that sort of ruling. But the court has ruled, and I'm waiting. I'd be interested to see it. Very disappointed in what I'm seeing right now about pedophilia, and I'm well aware of how what I hear, most of it is administrative problem, and it creates problems in families. But I've had families come to me and ask questions like, what do I do about Uncle so-and-so who comes over to our house and plays hanky-panky with our daughter? Those kind of problems come up from time to time. Well, straightforward answer most of the time. Here's another question. It says, my 4th grade son came home from school and told me in his class they had discussed different families, and he described books that had 2 daddies or 2 mommies. He asked me questions, and I didn't know how to answer his questions. What's going on? Well, in some classrooms, this is intentional teaching material to teach children that all sorts of families are equally acceptable. And it seems that the intention of that is to try to keep children from discriminating against children from different kind of families. Well, that by itself is laudable or acceptable, but it's not teaching children the right thing. I think we ought to have a pattern where we teach children that certain family types are better than others, not the children themselves and not the people are not better, but that there are certain models of the family that are preferred. And from that, then, we could help children developing preferences, which they would naturally have preference for, but they would, for their own lives, to model their own lives after. Now, I'm reminded of children in orphans' homes I used to see. I used to be a psychologist and with the state of Texas, and at the time, the orphans' homes didn't have a good place in the state budget. The state orphans' homes, the psychologists for the hospitals were also the psychologists for the orphans' homes. I used to marvel at the kids in these orphans' homes, how well they adjusted later in life. They seemed to do very well. I'm talking about in family life, because there was a consistent pattern in the orphans' homes that all I was aware of at that time. And I visited a lot of them. I visited the Baptist homes, the Methodist homes, the Seventh-day Adventist homes, the Masonic home, Church of Christ homes. I believe those are all the religious ones I visited, and along with the state. They all had the same model as far as what they were teaching about family life. They hadn't talked about this, as far as I know. They hadn't discussed it among themselves. But the people at the time had the same model. That the preferred model was two-parent family rather, and a mother at home. And this is what most of those orphans grew up thinking was the ideal type family, and that's what most of them grew up to be. It's a strange thing that they're teaching in some of these schools, because these kids are seeing the problems. They're seeing problems with sometimes even no parents. The children have been bounced around, and they're living with some stranger. I say stranger in terms of any relationship, legal relationship. One parent, 2 different adults, sometimes even the same sex, boyfriend, girlfriends of the parents, all kinds of things. The best substitute for the natural parent, it appears to be the grandparents. And I think we ought to be fair to children and teach that. Here's another one. Says, what do you think about the changing of the names for special holidays? I don't like that. I like Christmas. I like George Washington's birthday. I like Lincoln's birthday. I like Martin Luther King's birthday. Call it that, what it is. If you're going to have a holiday for it, call it that. I believe that's on January the 15th. 22nd of February, we used to know that was George Washington. February the 12th was Lincoln. Down in the South, we had Robert E. Lee. We had Emancipation Day, June 19th. We had holidays that were named for what they were supposed to be commemorating, and I think the push to do away with these things for political correctness or whatever other reason is a false sense of history. If we're going to have a holiday, call it what it is. We're celebrating Christmas, call it what it is. I haven't had anybody give me a good answer on the basis of what the justification is, except political correctness. And somebody wishes me happy holiday, well, I deliberately will answer on whatever holiday it's supposed to be. Well, like Merry Christmas or Happy New Year or whatever it is. To call it President's Day, I don't like it. Go to Armistice Day, November the 11th. When I was a youngster, this ritual was very important. The 11th day of the 11th hour, the 11th month, the 11th minute, it was important. It was 11/11 on November the 11th. It was Armistice Day. This was the signing of the armistice. And everything stopped. I remember very clearly in Wichita Falls, Texas, where the sirens in the city blew, the traffic lights all turned red, children in school got up and had a silent prayer at that 11th hour, the 11th day, and so on. And it was an important ritual. What did it teach us? It taught us that war had stopped, that war was bad, and when war stopped, it was worth celebrating. Well, no, Armistice Day has sort of gone by the wayside, hasn't it? You don't hear that expression. You hear Veterans Day, whatever, and they move it around to fit a holiday weekend. Nah, I like the old style better, and I don't think it's just because I'm old-fashioned. I'm old-fashioned, I'll admit that. But I think we ought to be honest about what we're celebrating and have it up front. Here's a question. It says, my boyfriend is having trouble getting along with my 11-year-old son, particularly in the morning before school. What can I do? Move. That boyfriend, what's he doing there at before school in the morning? See, I presume by the question that it's a live-in boyfriend situation and be there before school in the morning. What is the relationship supposed to be with your son and your boyfriend? You know, just because you like the guy, that doesn't mean your son does. It doesn't mean that your boyfriend likes your son. Each person has a right. But if he's living in your house, get him to move. If you're living in his house, you move and take your son with you. Because this kind of situation compounds all sorts of problems. Who's in charge anyway? What's your son supposed to do? How's he supposed to relate to this boyfriend? Is he the authority figure? Is he supposed to be the father figure? Is he supposed to mind him? Is he supposed to behave? An 11-year-old boy is getting big enough to think he has ideas of his own. And who is he? And then his own father, he may have all kinds of impressions from his own father about how he's supposed to behave. I don't like these situations where these live-in patterns like that, particularly where there are children involved. Because as far as I'm concerned, it always messes up the children. Who are they supposed to be and what are they supposed to be in reference to this person? Whether it's a boyfriend or a girlfriend, it's exactly the same thing applies. And when the men have their children and they have custody of their children and they move in a live-in girlfriend, men are more likely to just assume that the woman in the house is going to take charge of running the house and be more in charge of the children. So the women, in effect, who are the girlfriends, oftentimes get dumped on, I think, more than the men do. Here's a question. It says, my son, home on spring break, says that in his college they're being oriented to think that anyone who thinks he's gay is gay. Is that true? I hope not. What we know for certain, as research has been done on this, and quite extensive, is that there are 10 to 12% of the boys growing up, rather 25% of the boys who are 10 to 12 years old, about a fourth of them who are 10 to 12 years old will have a question about their own orientation, whether or not they're gay. They're worried homosexual. They don't usually use these days in schools, but it's hard to promote it in schools. Well, if a fourth of them have that question, see, if they have a question, they may ask a school counselor, and some school counselors aren't worth anything in my book, because they'll promote the, well, if you think you are, you are. Well, that's silly. Just because a kid asks a question. That's the way counselors and social workers often have their orientation. No, I said I don't think they're worth much. Well, school counselors do a good job in the main. But when it comes to these issues, I think it's their faulty education. It's their background. But I'm well aware that some colleges are promoting this, and only about 2% of the people grow up to be homosexual. Not 10, as a Kinsey report came out. That's been refuted quite a bit. And so what happened between that 25% of the kids who ask and later when they grow up only at 2%, well, we've had 23% have more shot along the way, haven't we? So it should be very important what we answer, how we answer children. And here's the last question. It has to do with the same basic area of life. It says, what do I think of same-sex couples adopting children? I think it's a tragedy. I think it's very serious. I think children who are up for adoption have already had a broken home. They've already had some kind of broken family. And they deserve the best they can get. That's beside the point that research shows that the children in these situations have higher patterns of suicides and illnesses and other kind of problems. And notwithstanding that a few of them seem to get along well in spite of it. I think this is sad for an agency. Any agency, and we know that there are long waiting lists for people to adopt children, any agency that preferentially gives children to same-sex couples, I think ought to lose its license. I think it's illegal, because any agency that knowingly puts children in jeopardy should be held accountable. I think that's sad, very sad. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good day. 17